Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Politics Matters podcast. I'm your host Ryan Jakubowski, and today we've got three interesting topics to dive deep into, starting with the Ohio Senate race. We're going to work our way to some interesting news out of Georgia, and then we're going to finish up with North Carolina and some quite interesting polling data that I saw a few days ago. So we're going to get right into it and take a look at Ohio and why this race might not be in reach for Democrats, but it's going to be very interesting to watch. So, yeah, in case you haven't been following this race, we've got a pretty chaotic Republican primary, whereas the Democrats, for once, are actually united behind one candidate who seems to be doing a pretty good job of appealing to this group of voters. So, Tim Ryan, who's currently the incumbent Democrat for the 13th District, which is based in the Mahoning Valley, it's a very working-class area. You know, has a lot of factories, a lot of warehouses, big in the auto industry, and he's mostly based out of Youngstown, and the areas in Mahoning and Trumbull County. So he's from a working-class district, he's running in a working-class state, and he's running in an environment where the Democratic Party is expected to take a hit with the working-class vote, and yet he seems to be doing a pretty good job from what I've seen. Now, that being said, we're 7 months out from the election. We've still got a long ways to go. You know, we're really only scratching the surface of what this election season is going to look like, because it really starts to heat up in June, and when that happens, we're going to get a better look at what Tim Ryan's campaign is going to look like. But the point for now is that what we've seen so far seems to suggest that he is in for a decent run here. I do not think he's going to win. I don't even think he'll come particularly close to winning, but I do think that what he's doing right now is very smart if you're running as a Democrat in Ohio in this day and age. So, to get into the Republican primary that I referenced, that is as chaotic as it gets, we've got 5 candidates who I think, there are I think 8 or 9 candidates actually running, but there are 5 that I'm going to talk about here because they're really the only 5 that actually have a Wikipedia profile, or, you know, they're the only 5 that actually are worth discussing in the sense that they have a chance of getting the nomination. And so, they're Matt Dolan, a state senator from the 24th District, Mike Gibbons, who is a banker, and he ran for Senate in 2018, lost the Republican primary, Josh Mandel, who's probably the most well-known out of these I'm going to name, former Ohio treasurer, and he lost the Senate race in 2012 to Sherrod Brown as a Republican. We've got Jane Timken, who is the former chair of the Ohio Republican Party when they had quite a successful run from 2017 to 2021. She has boasted a pretty good record of delivering the state to Trump in 2020 by a better margin than expected, and she also has been able to hold on to that gubernatorial election that was hotly contested in 2018 between Mike DeWine and Richard Cordray. And then lastly, J.D. Vance, who has written a few books, a former veteran, I believe, and he also is a venture capitalist. So these 5 candidates are all pretty interesting. They all have their ups and downs. You know, some are more experienced than others with regard to politics. Josh Mandel and Jane Timken are certainly at the higher end of the spectrum in terms of what they've done in Ohio for the Republican Party. Again, Mandel was treasurer of the state from 2011 to 2019, and he also ran for Senate in 2012, although, like I mentioned, he lost that race to Sherrod Brown. And it was a pretty embarrassing defeat for him because he was a top recruit because he was the treasurer. A lot of Republicans thought that they could flip that seat. It was, you know, and it coinciding with the presidential election with Romney and Obama. And the Republicans thought that they could get a turnout, especially with suburban voters, between Mandel and Romney. And it never happened. He lost the Senate race by 7 and ran behind Mitt Romney in the state. And it was a pretty embarrassing performance for him on that night. And so Mandel, since then, has, you know, kept a bit of a lower profile. He, again, won re-election to his treasurer spot in 2014, but that was a very Republican year. He didn't really face serious opposition, and he was someone that was expected to win. The Democrats did not even invest in his race. So his re-election in 2014 was certainly good for his career, but it wasn't telling of how things are going to go in the future. But this race right here is, when the chips are down, can Josh Mandel win? And we're going to have to talk about that in this primary, but we also have to remember that if he wins the primary, he's going to have to beat Tim Ryan, and he himself is what I consider to be a bad candidate in terms of electability. So, first of all, I'm not going to read his tweets on here, but if you read his tweets, I think it's evident that he's attempting to pander to a more extreme wing of the party, which might work well if you're on Twitter, but if that's how he talks in real life on a debate stage with Tim Ryan or, you know, campaigning, that's going to alienate a lot of more moderate Republicans. And I know that Ohio is a red enough state and that he can afford to lose a few votes, but the suburbs of Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus have been decent to Republicans in recent years. Like, even Trump, who didn't do well with suburbanites in Ohio, he was the first Republican, I think, to I think he won suburbanites by about 2%, but he didn't do particularly well with them. He was the first Republican to make that number within 5, I believe, and win the state. And if Mandel continues that kind of path of loss with suburbanites that recent Republicans have faced, this race is going to hurt the Republican Party at more levels than one. So, like I said, this Senate race is extremely likely to vote for the Republican Party. I would give them probably an 85 to 90% chance of winning it, and that might be generous. I think there's certainly an argument to be made that Tim Ryan maybe has a 20% chance if you are more of an optimist for him than I'm being right now. And certainly, if Tim Ryan runs a really good campaign, maybe in 3 months from now, I'll say that this race is, maybe he has a 1 in 3 chance of winning, right? Like, it's still early. It's still spring. It's still far enough away from the election that the narrative of this race can change. Like, I often have to remind people of this, but in April 2020, the Democrats were supposed to lose both Georgia seats by like 7%, and they ended up winning them, and they handed them the Senate. They weren't supposed to be competitive in, Montana or Kansas if things didn't go their way. And, things didn't go their way in the end, but Democrats were competitive in those states. In Alaska, there wasn't really a ton of, like, hype around Al Gross the way there was in October, but, in April, right? And so things can change, especially in politics. It's a fast-moving game, and it takes, one stupid statement by Josh Mandel or one really good pull for Tim Ryan for this race to change its trajectory. And so that's what I'm going to say about a Ryan versus Mandel matchup. But we'll get into that in a second. So the other 4 candidates that I want to talk about here are the 4 Republicans that I mentioned. And I guess I'll rank them because people like when I do rankings. Like, I think on Twitter someone tagged me and was like, I should rank the 5 Republicans who are going to be running in this race in terms of chance to get the nomination. And I guess I'll do that right here. So at number 5, Matt Dolan is probably there. He's not, doomed, but in the polling that we've seen on Real Clear Politics, like, if you take a look at where Dolan's at, Dolan's been pretty consistently at the bottom of the barrel with these bunch. Dolan has, he surged in the most recent poll. He went up from, 5% back in February, and he's now at 13% as of the most recent poll, which was from April 4th. So, yeah, it's a bit of a surge, if you will, but it's minimal. It's from 5 to 13%. On Wikipedia, he has a narrow lead over J.D. Vance, but like, that's, again, super subjective because Vance has been falling, and it's very close, and this is the first time that Dolan's ever, not been a bottom of these 5, but I'd expect him to continue to, kind of be in that bottom with Vance. If I had to guess, he probably comes 5th in the primary, but it's still too early to tell. We've got a few weeks left, and, those few weeks are going to really determine how this race unfolds. But Dolan is definitely the most underwhelming of these candidates to me. He's from a state Senate district that is, like, super suburban, super, just it's kind of like a ring around Cleveland, so it's not, super in tune with the base of the Republican Party in a primary. It's not super working class, super populist or rural or anything like that, so it doesn't really give a massive advantage to Dolan. But in the general, in the general election, Dolan will be a fine candidate. He'd probably win. So number 4 has probably going to be J.D. Vance. There was a lot of hype around J.D. Vance when his campaign began, but I think that he lacks the fundamental qualities that you need to win a Republican primary in a state like Ohio. Jane Timken, for example, has a lot of experience doing this, so that's why she's still in it, right? But J.D. Vance has not really been in politics, or he hasn't run for office before, and he also has not yet really picked up that group of support, right? Like, he's got a little bit of support left over from 2016, because in 2016 he was, most people don't know this, but in 2016 J.D. Vance was an anti-Trump author. He was a Republican who said, nope, I don't like Trump, I'm not going to vote for him. Now he's very pro-Trump. Now he even, kind of leaned into the whole 2020 election was stolen, conspiracy theories, which, again, are blatantly false, but, he's leaning into it for political purposes. And so that's going to help him a little bit, but it's also going to hurt him when when Josh Mandel brings up that, J.D. Vance opposed Trump 6 years ago, and now he's supposedly on board with it, right? So Vance's candidacy just seems flawed to me. Could I be wrong? Sure, he might come in the top 2, but I don't think he'll win. I think, again, if you made me guess, he's probably number 4. Number 3, I'm going to put Jane Timken. She's, got a lot of support from suburban Republicans. I think that she will in this primary win a few of those collar counties, Delaware County, which is right outside of Columbus. She might win Warren or Greene County, the counties that are right outside of Cincinnati. And she might even win, Summit County if she does really, really well in Akron. But it's going to depend on how well that coalition comes out for her, which in a primary I don't think it will, to be completely honest. Like, I could be wrong again. I always say this, but I don't think that the Republican Party is going to, especially in a state like Ohio, is going to send a pretty establishmentarian, more moderate figure to be their nominee when they can run a Mandel or a Gibbons, who are my top two. Mandel and Gibbons are definitely the top two in this race. In the latest polling that we've seen, the net from Real Clear Politics has Mandel at 18.7% and Gibbons at 20%, meaning that it's a virtual tie. Mandel had a lead in the two most recent polls that we saw from Akron and Fabrizio Lee. And then More Information Group came out, I think, a few days ago and had Gibbons up by 4. So the polling we've seen has been close no matter what. Like, no matter how you slice it, it's going to be close, right? But the majority of these polls have had Gibbons winning. And so, like if you go on Wikipedia, right, of the most recent 9 polls, 7 have had, or 6 have had Gibbons in the lead, 1 has had them tied, and then 2 given Mandel the lead. And so I don't want to make my predictions only off polling, but the undecided votes that are falling seem to be going in Gibbons' direction. And he's been surging, right? Like, he's the only one in this race who, to me, seems like he actually has the momentum here. Because Mandel he was the front runner from the beginning, right? But he hasn't, run away with it. And that's a red flag to me because it kind of reminds me of Andrew Yang. Because Andrew Yang was the front runner. He was going to win the race for New York City, right? And then he never ran away with it. He let the other guys stick around for too long. It's like a sports game, right? Like if you're the favorite at tip-off, right? Or if you're playing a football game at kickoff, whatever. And you are, maybe you have a narrow lead for most of the game, and you let the underdog hang around. They got the energy. They're going to bring it to you in the fourth quarter. And that's happening to Mandel. It happened to Andrew Yang. It's happened to a lot of politicians in the past. They come out stampeding out of the gate, front runners. Don't ever run away with the lead and they lose on election day. And I think that's what Mandel's headed down. Could I be wrong? Yeah, sure. He's only down by a point, right? It's still anyone's race, really. But I bet, if I had to bet right now, I would say Gibbons is the nominee. And so that leaves us with a Gibbons versus Ryan matchup. And Gibbons is interesting because he doesn't necessarily have the credentials that Mandel or Timken would have, because he hasn't, or even Matt Dolan, because he hasn't served in the state senate, he hasn't been the chair of a party, and he hasn't run for office in Ohio statewide before. And so that makes him a bit more vulnerable, right? And so that's what makes this race interesting, is because either Tim Ryan's going to run against someone who has zero filter, or someone like Mike Gibbons, who hasn't run a race before. And yeah, that might be an upside in the primary, but in a general election, when you haven't fundraised or done any of this before, that can be a liability. And it might look, and like the Republican Party of Ohio might have to bail him out if he, doesn't know how to fundraise, doesn't know how to, phone bank or campaign, right? So that's going to be an issue for them. And on top of that, in terms of Mandel has the liability of having already lost a race. And I get that it was in 2012. It was 10 years ago, right? But, Ohio voters already rejected him. And that's not a great sign if you want to win a race convincingly. And the Republicans need to, sure, they're going to win Ohio, but if they want to do it right, they have to win by, 10. Because if they come out of here and they, kind of limp to a 5-point win, the Democrats are winning a bunch of congressional seats in Ohio. Because remember, it's an effect. If a party does really well statewide, they will carry their candidates to the local level to victories. Like, if I'm running and I win California by 30 points, I'm going to carry my people on the, a state level or on the local level to victories. But if I only win my race by 1 point, it's a bigger swing towards the other party, right? So if Mandel does poorly in Ohio and he doesn't do very well in, the areas where there are competitive congressional districts, the Democrats might pick off a few, like the 1st district in Cincinnati, or they might pick off the 7th district, right? So I'm not saying they will, but I'm saying that if Mandel does poorly, the Democrats can net a few seats here, and they can take advantage and chip away at that lead. And so that's why the Ohio Republican Party needs to win this race and win it big. And Tim Ryan's putting pressure on them to do that. So he released an ad where he was it was him talking to workers at a warehouse, or a collection of them, but it was clearly designed to be pro-working class kind of shtick. And it was him asking them what the, quote, problem was. And the inferred problem was jobs, right? Because jobs are a big issue for working class and middle class voters, right? It's a winning issue. And so he asked these voters what their biggest fears were and, what the problem was. And the theme of the ad was China, where the workers would say China, and Tim Ryan would then say China, 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 right? And, like, I know China's become a buzzword, especially within Republican circles, because, you know, Donald Trump said China more than I have ever spoken. Like, let's be honest. Donald Trump was a he ran a campaign that's very, very tough on China. And so, clearly, there's a base for that in Ohio, because Trump did so well in Ohio, when, you know, both in the primary and when he ran for president. And so the point here is that Tim Ryan is trying to do something very smart, which is recapture China from the Republican Party. Because, like, there are a lot of working class voters in the Midwest who do not like China because, you know, they're scared their jobs are being shipped overseas. China's taking their jobs, they're taking their money, their companies are beating our companies, right, etc. It's a whole set of concerns about China that are valid, right? Like, there are valid concerns about China. I'm concerned about China, right? We all are concerned about China in a way. And so the Republican Party has been able to take that energy and get most of that on their side. And Tim Ryan is trying to run as a pro-working class Democrat from Mahoning County, who is going to be able to say, look, I'm the one who's going to stand up to China, not Josh Mandel, not Mike Gibbons, not whoever the Republicans run against me. I'm the one who's going to go fight for their jobs in the Senate. And if he can convey that message, he might not win, but he's certainly going to be doing a lot better than the Democrat who's going to lie down and do nothing. And so that's why, as of right now, I'm saying that Tim Ryan is the best Democrat running in terms of the campaign they're running relative to the state they're in for the Democrats. You know, we might see a better one in the future, but as of right now, it looks like Tim Ryan is doing the best job of trying to win his race of any Democrat. And if he can continue this rhetoric, it'll be very interesting to see how he ends up doing in November, because he might not win, but if he can carry a few more Democrats in congressional races to victory, that'll be massive for the Democratic Party, and it'll rejuvenate them in the Midwest. So that's Ohio. We're going to briefly get into a poll not a poll, but a news story in Georgia that I saw. And I want to talk about this really quickly because I don't think there's too much to address here, but I want to address this in a way that is productive. So I read a report, I think, I want to say 2 or 3 days ago, that had the Republican Party, or that said that the Republican Party was considering pulling out of Georgia because they have no hope for Herschel Walker. And that surprised me because Georgia would seem to me like it's their prime pickup opportunity, right? Like to say that it's trending blue, but it only voted for Joe Biden by like 0.2%, and Raphael Warnock is a vulnerable incumbent for the Democratic Party. But the Republicans, for whatever reason, are kind of fumbling this race, and Herschel Walker is fumbling. He had a lot of hype coming out of the gate. I thought he was going to win this race, and I still do think he'll win, right? But the fact that the Republican Party is considering just giving up on unseating Walker and focusing more on Cortez Masto and Kelly seems to me like they don't have faith in Herschel Walker. And I get where that comes from, right? Like, I get the concerns with Herschel Walker because he has a tendency to, I think, say things that aren't going to help him on the campaign trail. He also has a scandal that involves domestic abuse allegations, which I'm not going to get into here. But if you want to read up on those, they're pretty legitimate accusations. And they not only make him a bad person if they're true, but they also would seriously hurt his campaign. So, yeah, that's just a whole other set of issues the GOP has with Herschel Walker. But anyways, Walker and his inability to capture or to, I guess, cultivate the support that he needs is a big red flag. And the recent statements he's had about, I think, evolution were like he didn't understand how evolution worked, and he just said, I think, something totally ridiculous about it, will hurt his ability to win suburbanites in areas like Forsyth or in Cobb or in Gwinnett, in areas that of outer Atlanta that are educated and that have tended to swing more Democrat in recent years. So if I'm not saying that one statement alone is going to hurt Walker, but if you got that plus the scandals plus the fact that he's going to probably have a few more blunders and gaffes along the way, that makes the Republican Party really nervous, especially against a pretty incumbent like Raphael Warnock, who did win in 2021. So I'm just going to throw that out there. I don't want to make a prediction on this race yet. It's a toss-up in my eyes. I could see the Democrats winning. I could see Walker still coming out with it, but I'm certainly a bit less confident in my Walker prediction than I was a month ago because of this recent hesitancy from the Republican Party in Georgia. So, yeah. Now, the second half of the show is going to be dedicated to talking a little bit about North Carolina. because there was a pretty peculiar poll that came out last week that I thought was quite interesting, especially because it showed a lot of different results for a pretty competitive Senate race, or at least if the polls right, the race would be competitive. So the poll surveyed 1,047 likely voters, and it was from Emerson College, which was an A- rating from 538, so it's a pretty good pollster, at least according to Nate Silver. And they asked voters who they'd vote for in a matchup where the Democrat was always Sherry Beasley, because she'd probably be the Democratic nominee, like 99% chance, against 4 potential Republican nominees, and they were Mark Walker, Pat McCrory, Ted Budd, and Marjorie Easton. Budd had the biggest lead over Beasley. He was at 50%, she was at 43%. Walker had the next biggest. He was at 5%, and she was at 2%. Eastman had a 1% lead over Beasley. She was at 45, she was at 44. But then, interestingly enough, Sherry Beasley was beating former Governor Pat McCrory, because she was up by 2%, she was at 43%, he was at 41%. And this poll isn't even, like, that good for Democrats. Like, it's not like I read a poll, I'm like, oh my god, they're saved in North Carolina, they're going to win the Senate race here, right? Like, no, this poll isn't, like, great news for Democrats. It's just really interesting because it shows that there is room for North Carolina to maneuver in terms of who the Republicans run. Clearly, Mark Walker and Ted Budd are good candidates, and I think both of them would win pretty easily. Marjorie Eastman's not going to get the nomination, so I'm just going to chuck her name out of the basket of discussion here. So we're just going to narrow it down to Walker, McCrory, and Budd against Sherry Beasley. Beasley, however, is leading McCrory. And for those of you who don't know, Pat McCrory is the former governor of North Carolina. He was elected first in 2012, then he lost re-election in 2016 by a very narrow margin. He lost to Roy Cooper. And it was interesting because he lost by, I think, 0.4% or something like that. It was definitely under a point. There was a recount, so it was a close race. He lost by like 0.4% on a ballot in which Trump won by 3.6%. So he underperformed Trump by about 4% in a pretty good year for Republicans. So, and that just goes to show how much voters in North Carolina are willing to vote Republican in most races, but then they'll turn away from a Republican like Pat McCrory for whatever reason. And so I don't really know what McCrory's curse is. He wasn't a popular governor, but it's not like voters hold like specific scandal or policy against him the way that, you know, like Chris Christie or Sam Brown back. It's just that he's not popular for whatever reason. And so Pat McCrory is, you know, running for the Senate seat, and he's going to want to, you know, obviously win this seat and be their next Republican senator from North Carolina. And yet he is just failing to galvanize that momentum. Like, yeah, sure, we're probably going to see a poll that has him winning later. But, like, we saw a range of numbers in which Ted Budd was at 50% at the best of Republicans, then Pat McCrory fell to 41%. So there are a lot of Republicans that are saying, I'm going to vote for Ted Budd for sure, but I'm not going to vote for Pat McCrory. Some of them are undecided if it's McCrory versus Beasley, and others are just going to vote for Beasley anyways because they dislike McCrory. And so this isn't, like, relevant because it would all of a sudden make Sherry Beasley the favorite if she ran against Pat McCrory. No, the race would still be lean Republican if McCrory was the Republican nominee, and he'd be favored. But it would make the Republicans have to reallocate funds back to North Carolina to try to win this seat, which is the last thing Mitch McConnell wants. McConnell wants to run a thin map. He wants to focus on holding Pennsylvania, which is really the only competitive seat the Republicans are going to have to try to hold, to be honest, and then win at least 2 of the 3 of Georgia and North Carolina. And then he wants to win 2, maybe 3 of the Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada races that all have Democratic incumbents. And so, if he has to spend time in North Carolina, that takes away his ability to spend more money and pour it all into Nevada, Georgia, or Arizona. And so, this is bad news for Republicans because, A, it will hurt their foothold or whatever polling lead they get in one of those states, and it will allow the Democrats to go on the offensive. And it will also force a lot of media attention away from those states into North Carolina. And in case you haven't been paying attention, the Democrats aren't a super popular party right now. They're not, like, at all popular. In fact, the most unpopular they've been in, I think, 15, 20 years. And this is including pretty bad years for Democrats. Like, Democrats have had their fair share of disastrous elections in the 2010s. Like, I've been alive for quite a few Democratic disasters, as they call it, right? 2010, Democrats lost a record number of House seats, and they lost, 6 Senate seats. In 2014, Democrats lost 9 Senate seats, lost control of the chamber, and then lost like another 40 House seats or something insane like that. And then in 2016, we all know Hillary Clinton thought she'd win the race. We thought Democrats would have control of the Senate and a slimmer minority in the House. And then in 2016, Trump was elected president, and the Republicans held on to both chambers of Congress. Like, Democrats have not had an amazing 2010s. It's actually been not great for them, to be honest with you. Like, 2020 wasn't, like, the only good election for Democrats in the 2010s was really 2012. And 2018 was good too, but it was a midterm. It was practically handed them on a silver platter, and they still fell short in a few regions. And so 2010s didn't really have like this massive Democratic wave the way, and so the 2010s didn't have like this massive Democratic wave the way 2002, 2006, 2008, which are 2 consecutive Democratic waves actually. And so this is like me saying that the Democrats are fundamentally unpopular for the first time in 20 years isn't like this whole, oh, well, they were unpopular in 2016 and, they were okay 4 years later. No, they're underwater the way they were after 9/11 when the Democrats were polling 17% behind Republicans in generic ballot polls nationally. And then 2002, in that midterm, and it was the first midterm in like 25 years in which the party in power actually gained a Senate seat. Like, 2002 was a disaster for Democrats. They should have taken a midterm, should have ran away with it, should have dunked on Bush the entire time, and they lost a Senate seat, and they didn't even do anything in the House. Like, it was awful for them. They didn't recover. In 2004, they lost a presidential election. They thought they were going to win. John Kerry thought he was going to win. And it took them another 2 years. 2006 was the first year of that decade, to be honest, where Democrats actually had a plan to win, and they actually did win in 2006. They did really well in 2006. This all goes to say that Democrats are in a bad position. It's comparable to a position they were in the early 2000s, which was the low point of their, lifetime with the past 30 years. And so if we're heading down that route again for Democrats, and 2022 is another 2002 for the Democratic Party, they're in deep trouble. They're not winning the White House back till 2028 is what that means. And they're not going to hold the Senate until God knows when. And so this is all, this is a pretty bleak time for Democrats. And we still are seeing decent polling for them. They're still, doing okay in races where they're supposed to be losing or close to losing. And they have polling leads in North Carolina, which makes no sense. But it's still worth noting. And I just want to look at the crosses of this poll now, which it was actually being kind of annoying because it would not let me look at the demographic analysis. I hopefully I'm not being totally oblivious to what's going on, but I read the entire thing, right? It told me methodology. It told me basically everything I would have wanted to know except for what I wanted to actually know, which was the number of white, black, Latino, college educated, non-college educated, income, age, gender. Just the demographics of the poll, but whatever. The important thing about this poll, though, that they did give me is that Biden has a 44% approval rating in North Carolina, while 52% disapproval rating. So in this poll, Biden was 8% underwater in the state, which isn't great, but it's not also as bad as we've seen in other polls. But he's 8% underwater, and so he's still getting his candidate, Sherry Beasley, to win by 2% against Pat McCrory. Now, it's still a poll 7 months out. It still is a bunch of undecided. It's not like this poll would even be accurate if it was a McCrory versus Beasley matchup. But it's interesting to see that we're getting a survey that shows Biden being 8% underwater in a state, and yet the Democratic Party is still winning a Senate race there. This more than anything goes to show the Democrats have a fighting chance in a lot of races that they might not expect to have a fighting chance in. It doesn't mean they're going to win North Carolina. It doesn't mean they're going to win Ohio. It doesn't mean they're going to have control of the Senate or the House in 2022. But if they can minimize their losses in 2022, they can head into the future saying, okay, it was a rough year. It's going to be another few rough years. But if we can come out of 2024, 2022 with a majority in the House and a decent amount of seats in the Senate, things are going to be okay in the future. And this is all really interesting because Biden's approval's been atrocious. He's 10% underwater now. I haven't even been following because it's been so consistently bad for Joe Biden. And so he's been underwater. He's been constantly falling. It's always new poll shows Biden approval worst it's ever been. Yeah, we get that. And so you'd expect the Democrats to be getting wiped off the map after 2022. And it's oh, well, if Biden has a 60% disapproval rating, then surely the Republicans are going to turn out in droves and he'll lose a bunch of seats, right? But we haven't seen that. Senate polling has said the Democrats pretty neck and neck with Republicans in Pennsylvania. They've had them winning in North Carolina, which is weird. They've had them, a poll from a few months ago had Tim Ryan, I think, up by 1 in Ohio, which made no sense at all. But okay? And they've had the generic ballot only being R+2 when Biden's 10% underwater. So the consistent thing we're learning here is not that Democrats are going to lose a massive amount of seats because of Biden's unpopularity. It's that, yes, Biden's unpopular, and the polling we've seen has reflected that in every way, shape, and form. But the Democratic Party is nowhere near close to as unpopular as Joe Biden is. They're still unpopular, but they're not as negatively viewed by the public as the Biden administration is. And so there are a lot of voters who, and like I've talked with this before, there are a lot of voters who are saying, I don't like Joe Biden to those polls, right? And then they're going out and saying, I'm still going to vote Democratic. I just don't like that he hasn't canceled student loan debt. I don't like that he hasn't done this or this or this, right? And they're still going to vote Democrat. Like, they're not going to switch over to the GOP because they don't like Biden, especially if they're progressives who think he hasn't gone far enough. Like, progressives are either going to stay home or vote Democrat. And a lot of them are stay home, by the way. Like, this isn't like, not all people are going to vote, by the way. But the progressives that are going to be voting in 2022 are going to be voting for Democrats. Even if they don't like Joe Biden, which many of them don't, they're still be voting for Democrats. And there are a lot of even moderate Democrats who think Joe Biden's gone too far to the left. There aren't as many, per se, but there are some. And so they might think that Joe Biden's gone too far, but they're still going to vote for the Democratic Party, especially if they're loyal to that party. And so all this data is showing us is that, yes, Biden's unpopular. We're going to corroborate that as many times as we need to in this polling. But at the same time, Democrats are doing okay in polling. They're not doing as well as they were in 2020 or in 2018, but they're holding on to a lot of seats that they are supposed to be losing. And so this North Carolina poll doesn't mean that the Democratic Party is going to win the Senate race, or that Sherry Beasley is going to somehow pull off a miracle and beat out Ted Budd or Pat McCrory. What it means is that the polls are actually quite consistent. The polls are showing us that Biden's unpopular, but that the Democratic Party can still survive. There are a lot of voters who are going to disapprove of Joe Biden, but are still going to vote for the Democratic Party just because they have no other option. So this means that the Democrats are not going to get wiped out the way they were in 2010 or 2014. It's going to be bad, don't get me wrong. I think the Democratic Party is going to have a bad night, but they're not going to get wiped out the way they were in 2010 or 2014. And that is pretty good news for them. It's one of the rare blips of good news they're going to get within these next few months. Thank you for listening to the Politics Matters podcast. I am your host, Ryan Jakubowski. I'm out for right now, but I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy, if you're on YouTube, click the like button. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever, share it with a friend. Tell me what you think. DM me. Let me know what you think of the show. Any suggestions? I got a few last show. I took them. I hope you guys like this show as well. But thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you all next week. Have a great rest of your week, guys.